I have handed a great many letters across that counter in my 40 years, and I have learned to read a face faster than the address on an envelope. So I knew, the morning the noon stage came in early and a lame man stepped down into the mud of Cedar Gap, that I was looking at the end of a story I had thought was finished. I had postmarked the beginning of it myself, 6 years before, and I had spent every season since believing it had no good end left in it. Let me tell it the way it came to me, which is the way most true things come to a man at a post office window, a piece at a time, out of order, with the most important part withheld until last. Sabra Hale was the only child of old Ardle Hale, who ran horses on Sparrow Creek out past the Antelope Breaks before either she or I had any gray in us. Ardle was a hard, fair, close-mouthed man who had buried a wife and decided the world owed him nothing further, and he raised the girl the way he'd have raised a son he was proud of and a daughter he was afraid for, both at once. By the time she was grown, she could gentle a green colt that 3 grown men had given up on, and she kept her father's tally book in a hand neater than the banks. She was not what the town called a beauty, and the town, being the town, made sure she heard about it. She had a plain, steady face and steady gray eyes and a way of looking at a foolish man until he ran out of foolishness. I thought she was the finest young woman in the county, but then I was old enough already to know what a face is worth after 30 years, which is almost nothing. Gideon Vance came up to the breaks the spring he was 24, drifting on a played-out horse with 40 cents and a saddle that was better than the rest of him put together. He hired on with Ardle for the gathering, and he stayed for the branding, and he stayed past when the work ran out, and any fool could see why he stayed. He was a quiet, big-knuckled young man with a temper he kept on a short rein and a streak of pride in him a yard wide. He came to my window every week that summer to mail a letter to a mother back in Missouri, and I came to like him for that alone, for you would be surprised how few young men remember they have a mother. He and Sabra circled each other most of a year before either of them admitted to it. I had a clear view of the whole business from behind the wicket, the depot being where the whole county came sooner or later. I watched him learn that she did not want a man to make a fuss over her, and I watched her learn that under all that pride, he was tender as a peeled willow. The day Ardle Hale's heart quit him in the corral, it was Gideon who carried him in, and Gideon who stood at the grave with his hat in both hands while Sabra stood dry-eyed, holding herself together with nothing but her own spine. After I saw him take her hand, she let him. That was the whole of it, the way those two did things, no flowers, no speeches, just a hand taken and not given back. They were to be married in the fall, but Ardle had died owing money the way close-mouthed men sometimes do, owing it quietly so no one knew the size of it until the man was in the ground, and the note came due, and there was no putting it off. The horses would not bring enough at the local sale. The good market was north, in the railhead towns, where army contractors paid in real coin for broke saddle stock. So Gideon did the thing a proud young man does. He told her he would take the gather north himself, sell high, clear the debt, and be back before the first hard snow. He would not let her come, the trail was no place for it, and somebody had to hold the place. He gave her his word at my counter, in fact, where he'd come to buy stamps for the road. I remember he said it low, the way a man says a thing he means more than he can carry. 6 weeks, he told her. 8 at the worst. I'll write you from every town with a post office, and I'll be standing in this doorway before the creek freezes, and we'll do the rest of it then. She didn't cry. She told him to mind the river crossings and not to sell the gray mare no matter what they offered, because the gray was hers. Then she let go of his hand, which was the hardest thing I ever saw her do, and he rode north with 3 other men and 100 head, and the dust of them hung in the road a long while after. He kept his word about the letters. That is the part that matters, and the part nobody knew for years but me, and I did not understand what I knew until it was nearly too late. The first letter came from a town 2 weeks up the trail, a few lines, the hand stiff, telling her the gather was holding together and the gray was sound, and he was thinking of her at the river crossings. I gave it to her myself, and watched her read it twice standing at the window, and then fold it small and put it inside her coat against her, and I looked back down at my sorting so as not to be caught watching. The second came from farther on. The third said they'd reached the railhead, that prices were good, that the debt would clear with money left over, and that he'd be starting home inside the month. Then the letters stopped. A month went by, and then the leaves, and then the creek began to skim over of a morning. No letter. She came to my window every mail day, regular as the sun, and every mail day I had to shake my head, and every mail day she said, "Thank you, Mr. Fry," in that same even voice, and walked out straight back into the cold. I have done some hard things at that window. Telling that woman nothing, week on week, was among the hardest. What we heard, finally, did not come through the mail. It came through a sad Dunmore. Dunmore had the big spread south of the breaks, the one with the deep wells and the standing grass, and he had wanted Sparrow Creek for as long as anyone could remember, because Sparrow Creek had the one reliable spring in that whole dry country, and his stock outgrew his water every summer. He was a smooth, heavy, prosperous man, the kind who is generous in public and counts it twice in private, and he had been a fixture at Artle's funeral, all sympathy, and a fixture at Sabra's gate ever since. He came to town that winter with a long face and a piece of news he said he'd had from a freighter up north. There had been trouble on the trail home, he said. A river up high and full, a wagon and some riders lost at the ford. He was sorry to be the one to say it. Gideon Vance, he said, was not coming back. Drowned the way he heard it with 2 others, somewhere north of the railhead, and never recovered. He said it kindly. That was the worst of a sad Dunmore. He never did an unkind thing unkindly. He brought her the news the way a man brings a gift, and he let it sit a respectful while, a month, 2 months, and then he began, very gently, very patiently, to come around. I will say this for Sabra Hale. She did not believe him, not all the way. Not for a long time, and she did not fall into his arms grateful for a strong man to lean on, which is the story he plainly had in mind. She wore black for a season because the town expected it of her, and then she put it off because she said she had no proof to mourn by, only a sad Dunmore's word, and she did not consider a sad Dunmore's word proof of sunrise. But she had a debt cleared by a man who was now gone, and a place to run alone, and a winter coming, and a neighbor at her gate every other week with his hat in his hand and an offer in his mouth. The offers changed shape over the years the way water finds its level. First it was help. He'd send 2 of his hands over for the heavy work, no charge, neighborly. She thanked him and hired a drifter instead and paid him out of her own pocket. Then it was partnership. He'd run his overflow stock on her grass and split the increase, a sensible arrangement between 2 places that needed each other. She told him Sparrow Creek needed nothing of his. Then it was the open thing, the thing it had always been under the others, that a woman alone could not hold that country, that he had admired her since Artle's day, that she would want for nothing as his wife, and the place would be safe under one strong brand at last. He said the word safe a great deal. He was always telling her how unsafe she was. She refused him every time in that even voice, and every time he smiled and said there was no hurry, time was on his side, and went home. And the terrible thing was that he was right about the time. The years do wear at a person. I watched them wear at her across my counter. She came in less for the mail and more for the supplies, and she stopped looking at the door when the stage came in. And one year I noticed she had gray coming at her temples same as me, and I thought, she is going to give in. Not because she loves him, because she is tired and alone, and the man is patient, and the human heart can only stand at a frozen gate so many winters before it goes inside to the fire that's offered, even a cold fire. The 6th winter she came as near to it as ever she came. Dunmore had bought up Artle's old note. He'd gone to the bank quiet and bought the paper that the trail money had paid down, but not, it turned out, paid clean off. There being a remnant of it Gideon had meant to clear on his return and never had. It was a small sum by then, but it was a hook in her, and Dunmore held the line gentle and let her feel it. He did not threaten. He never threatened. He only mentioned, sorrowful, that the note was his now, and that of course he'd never press a neighbor, and that a marriage would make the whole matter disappear like frost off a window. She told me about it at the counter, not asking for anything, just needing to say it once to a man who'd known her father. "I think I am going to have to do it, Mr. Fry," she said. "I have run out of reasons not to." She wasn't crying. She had stopped crying years before. That was worse than crying. I want to be honest about myself in this story, because a man telling a thing he's proud of will leave out the part where he was a coward, and I was a coward for 6 years. I had handled every letter that came up that trail, and early on that first silent winter before Dunmore's news, there had been a thing I noticed and did not chase. The northbound mail in those days went through a relay at a place called Coalbank Crossing, a miserable little swing station where a man named Tice kept the books and the horses and his own counsel, and Tice was a man Asad Dunmore had done favors for. I had wondered, that first winter, why a man as faithful with letters as Gideon Vance had gone dead silent all at once. Faithful men don't change in a day. I had wondered, and I had been busy, and I had told myself it was the river, the way Dunmore told it, and I had let it lie. A wondering you don't chase is just a coward's rest. I have had to live with that. So that is where matters stood the morning. The noon stage came in early. It came in early because the high water that year was down, and the driver had made up time on the flat, and he rattled up to my platform a good half hour before I looked for him, so that I was still sorting the southbound sack when I heard the brake go on and the team blow. I heard the door, and I heard boots, and I heard a man's voice ask the driver something, and then I heard nothing at all, because the voice had gone through me like cold water through a man asleep. I came around the counter without knowing I'd moved. He was standing in the road. He was thin where he had been broad, and there was gray in him that hadn't earned its way honest, the kind that comes early from pain, and he stood with his weight thrown off one leg in a way that told you the leg had been broke bad and set worse and would never be right again. He had a cane, a plain hickory cane, and a saddlebag over his shoulder that didn't have much in it. 6 years had been hard to him in a way they are not hard to a man who's only grown older. But it was Gideon Vance. I knew him the way you know your own name said in a crowd. "Mr. Fry," he said. He looked at the depot like a man checking that the world was where he'd left it. Does Sabra Hale still hold the Sparrow Creek place?" I will tell you that I could not speak for a moment. When I did, the first thing out of me was the foolish thing, the thing 6 years of cowardice asks. "We were told you drowned." Something crossed his face, not surprise. He had the look of a man hearing the last piece of a thing he'd half figured out alone in the dark. "I came near it," he said. "But no, I wrote her. I wrote her from the railhead and 3 towns after, soon as I could hold a pen." He shifted on the cane. "I'd had a wagon go over me at the high ford coming home. That's the truth in the drowning, I expect. That's what got back to you twisted. Crushed this leg and laid me up the better part of a year in a charity ward 200 miles the wrong direction. No money, no name anybody knew. I wrote her the day I could sit up. I wrote her once a month for 5 years, Mr. Fry. From every place I worked my way through trying to get the fare home. She never answered one. So he stopped. His jaw worked. I quit writing 2 years back. I figured a man who comes home crippled and broke, and 2 years past dead to a woman is doing her no kindness to come at all. I told myself I'd let her be. He looked at me, and there was the old pride in it, and under the pride was a thing I cannot describe to you except to say it was the look of a man who has talked himself out of the one thing he wants, and is hopping to God somebody talks him back in. Then I couldn't any more, so I sold my saddle and bought a stage ticket. I just had to see was she all right. I'm not asking more than that. She never answered one. 5 years of letters. I stood there in my own doorway with 40 years of other people's mail behind me, and I understood, all at once and far too late, exactly what I had not chased. The letters had not failed to come. They had been stopped. Stopped at Coalbank Crossing, where Tice kept the books and owed Asad Dunmore his favors. A man who would buy up a dead man's note to hook a living woman would think nothing of paying a swing station agent to lose a few envelopes in a stove. Gideon, I said. She held the place. She is all right, and she never had your letters. I had to stop and steady myself, an old man's voice not being the reliable instrument it once was. Not one of them. She was told you were dead by the man who wanted her land, and she has fought him off 6 years on nothing but her own stubbornness because some part of her would not believe it, and he has near worn her down. There is talk of a wedding before spring. I came the rest of the way out the door. Son, if you are going to go out there, you had best go now, because patience like a sad Dunmore's wins in the end, and the end is about due. I have never seen a tired man straighten the way that one straightened. I will not pretend I stayed behind. I have told you I was a coward for 6 years, and I had a debt of my own to pay on it. I shut the wicket. The southbound could wait. The U.S. mail could wait. I had let it run my conscience long enough, and I hired the livery's fastest team, and I drove that crippled man the 11 miles out to Sparrow Creek myself, and we did not say 3 words the whole way, and the country went by gold and brown the way it does in the late fall, and my heart was going like a young man's. But the thing I want you to understand, the thing that has stayed with me longest, is what we found when we got there, because it tells you who Sabra Hale was better than anything I could say of her. Asad Dunmore's buggy was already at her gate. We came up the creek road, and there it was, the matched team and the polished rig, and there was Dunmore himself on her porch, hat in hand in his good coat, and there was Sabra in the door, and we were close enough as we came that I could see her face, and I will tell you that it was the face of a woman about to say yes to a thing she did not want because she had run clean out of reasons to say no. 6 years of patient pressure, and a winter coming and a note hanging over the place. He had picked his morning. He always picked his morning. Gideon was out of the wagon before I had the team stopped. I do not know how a man with a leg like that got down so fast. He came up that yard on his cane, and he did not run because he could not run, and somehow that was worse to watch and better, the slow, terrible determination of it, and he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and he took off his hat, and he said her name. Just her name, Sabra. She turned. I watched the news of it go through her the way weather goes across open country. You can see it coming a long way off, and then it is on you all at once. She had buried this man 6 times over, once each winter, and made herself live, and here he was at the bottom of her steps with gray in his hair and a cane in his hand, saying her name in the voice she'd carried inside her coat for 6 years. She did not faint. She did not cry out. She put one hand flat against the doorframe. I saw that, the hand against the wood, the way a person steadies against a world that's tilted, and she said, very low, so low I barely caught it across the yard, "You wrote to me. Not are you alive, not where have you been. You wrote to me," as if she had always known underneath that the silence was a lie, and the only thing she had needed all those years was for someone to confirm it, as if his coming back was a smaller miracle than the simple fact that he had not, after all, forgotten her. "Every month," Gideon said. "For 5 years. I've got no proof of it but my word, and I know what a crippled man's word is worth against 6 years of quiet, but I swear to you, Sabra, I wrote until I broke and quit, and quitting is the only wrong I did you." And here is where Asad Dunmore made his single mistake, the only one in 6 patient years, and it was the mistake of a man who has never once doubted he will win. He should have stood quiet. A wiser deceit would have stood quiet, looked grieved, let the strangeness of the moment work, played the steady present man against the ghost off the noon stage. Instead, the blood went out of his face, and he said, too fast, the words a man says only if he already knows the answer. There's no call to believe a word of this. The man's a stranger and a beggar. What letters? Where are these letters? There were never any letters. There were never any letters. I had not told him about the letters. Gideon had not said the word letters to him. He'd said it only to her. No one had said, in Asad Dunmore's hearing, that there were letters that had failed to arrive. A man who knew nothing would have asked, "What's all this? Who is this?" Only a man who had spent 6 years making certain those letters never came would leap straight to swearing they had never existed. I am an old postman, and I have a postman's memory, and I said it before I had decided to. "Now how?" I said from the wagon seat, loud, in the voice I use across a crowded counter on land sale day. "Would you know whether there were letters or not, Asa? Nobody's mentioned any letters but the man himself, and you weren't here for that. Unless you've spent some particular thought on the subject. Unless you happen to know a man named Tice, out at Coalbank Crossing, who keeps the relay and owes you favors and has a good hot stove." The yard went very quiet. The creek talked to itself over the stones the way it always does. Sabra looked from Dunmore to me and back, and I watched her put it together. She was always quicker than the men around her, and she put it together faster than I'd said it, and the tiredness went off her face and something came up underneath it that I had not seen since before her father died. Not rage. Worse than rage for a man like Dunmore. Contempt, clear and cold and final. "Get off my porch, Asa," she said. He tried. I will give the devil that he tried. There was bluster about the note, the money owing, what the bank would say, a respectable man's reputation against a beggar's tale. But it was over, and he knew it was over. You could see him know it. And a man's threats are never so empty as when he already knows. Sabra Hale stood in her own doorway and told him she would have his note paid to the bank in coin inside the week, and never wished to see his buggy on her road again, and that if he cared for his respectable reputation, he had best pray no one in the county ever asked Tice at Coalbank Crossing what became of a drover's mail, because she intended to ask, and the postmaster of Cedar Gap intended to ask alongside her, official. She did not raise her voice once. She did not have to. He went down the steps past Gideon without looking at him, the way you walk past a thing you can't afford to see, and he got in his fine buggy and turned his matched team and drove out, and that is the last that man ever amounted to in this story, which is more than he deserved and exactly as much as he earned. I busied myself a great while with the harness after that. A man learns at a public counter when to look hard at his own hands. When I let myself look up, Gideon had got himself up the steps somehow, the cane forgotten leaning against the rail, and Sabra had hold of both his hands the way she'd let him take hers at her father's grave, taken and not given back, and they were not saying much. There is not much to say. 6 years is a thing you cannot fill with talk. You can only stand inside it together until it stops being a wound and starts being a thing you survived. I heard him say something low about the leg, about being half a man, about her deserving whole, and I heard her say, and this is the only part I'll quote, because it's the part worth keeping, she said, "I waited 6 years for the wrong half of you to come home, Gideon Vance. I'll take whichever half you've got." They were married before the creek froze, that same fall, in the way he'd promised 6 years gone. Only she came to the doorway of my depot to do part of it, because she said the depot was where his word had been given, and the depot was where she wanted the first of it kept, and I was proud enough to bursting to be asked to stand up with them. I paid Tice a visit too in time with the law for company, and the truth of those letters came out plain, and a sack of them, yes, a sack, the man hadn't even burned them all, had kept some back out of pure low cunning thinking they might be worth something someday. A sack of them came back to her at last, 2 years and more of a crippled man's faithfulness, written in a hand that got steadier as the months went on. She read them all. She read them over more than one winter. She told me once that she was glad, in a strange way, that they'd come late, because reading them slow across the warm years was a sweeter thing than tearing through them all at once would have been, and a person ought to take what sweetness the bad years owe them, paid out in arrears. Gideon never rode well again, but a man does not need to ride well to keep books and gentle a colt from the ground and raise children who are not afraid of him, and Sparrow Creek throve under the two of them in a way it never had under one. The spring ran reliable. The brand stayed Hale, by her wish and his agreement, which tells you something about both of them. And every now and again, even years on, when the noon stage came in, I'd see one or the other of them glance at it, just a glance, just the eyes going to the door, the way you'll touch an old scar to be sure it's healed. I am an old man now, and I have handed across that counter 10,000 letters that meant nothing and a few hundred that meant everything. And I have learned that the worst thing in the world is not the bad news a letter brings. The worst thing is the letter that's written and stamped and faithful and never allowed to arrive. The word given that's stopped on the road by a small mean man with a stove. I let one of those lie for 6 years out of nothing but a coward's busyness. And I have spent the rest of my life glad past saying that the man who wrote them was stubborn enough to climb onto a stage with a broke leg and a soled saddle, and come say her name in the road himself, since I'd failed to deliver the rest. She would have given in that morning. I saw her face in the door. One more week and a sad Dunmore would have had Sparrow Creek and the spring and the woman besides, all without raising his voice, the way patient cruelty takes the world. But the noon stage came in early, and the leg held him up the steps, and 6 years of faithful silence finally got to speak its piece. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. Some letters arrive late. The thing to know is that they arrive.